The smell of coffee sat over row 14, the way it does on every ordinary flight, faint and a little burnt, mixed with the drone of two engines that had not changed pitch in 2 hours. Then the public address system crackled, and a voice that should have been calm was not. "This is your captain," it said, and it broke on the word captain like something bent past its rating. "I need to know if there is anyone on this aircraft who has flown a combat aircraft. Anyone, please use your call button now." Nobody moved. What is written on the folded paper Wendell Colvin keeps touching in his shirt pocket, and why does he touch it only when he thinks no one is watching? That question would still be open when this was over. What would not be open, what would already be decided by the time anyone thought to ask it properly, was whether a 76-year-old man who had not touched a set of flight controls in 53 years could take 186 souls through a storm line to a runway he had never seen, on an airplane built 40 years after the one he'd trained on, with nothing to go on but a voice on a radio and whatever was left in his hands. If you've ever been the quiet one nobody thought to ask, type steady in the comments. The turbulence had come without warning, the kind that empties a cabin's stomach before it empties its overhead bins, and somewhere forward of row 10, a sound had traveled back through the fuselage that was not thunder and was not the plane. It was the sound of the flight deck door absorbing something on the other side of it. The seatbelt sign had been on. Most of the cabin had obeyed it. In seat 14C, an old man in a barn coat had obeyed it too, though he had buckled his belt 11 minutes before the sign came on, for reasons that belonged to him alone. He sat motionless while everyone around him turned. They turned toward the aisle, toward the flight attendants, toward each other, toward the four corners of a question none of them had an answer to. A man 2 rows up, half rose out of his seat, as if standing would help him see something worth seeing. A woman across the aisle from Wendell pressed her hand flat against her chest and did not look away from the curtain at the front of the cabin. Nobody looked at Wendell Colvin. Not really. Not the way you look at a thing you expect to matter. He was 76 years old, dressed like a man who had come from a feed store rather than a boarding gate, and he had the particular stillness of someone who has decided, a long time ago, that most rooms do not need to hear from him. The captain's voice came again, thinner this time, asking the same question with less air behind it, and still Wendell did not move, though something in his jaw had already begun, quietly, to set. The coat had been Faye's idea 30 years back, bought a size too big so it would still fit him heavy or thin, and it had outlived the reason for the extra room the way most of Faye's ideas outlived their occasions. It hung on him now, the color of a dirt road in August, the canvas gone soft at the collar, a rip at the left cuff, mended with waxed thread, in a stitch too even to have been done by a machine. Underneath it, his flannel shirt was worn thin at both elbows. The plaid faded to something closer to a memory of plaid than the pattern itself. His hands lay folded in his lap, and if you watched them long enough, you would see the faintest tremor pass through the right one, a small persistent shiver that came and went like a draft, finding a gap in a window frame. It was not fear. It had been with him for 11 years, since a winter his doctor called essential and Wendell called none of your business, and it did the same thing every single time a task in front of him required his hands to matter. It stopped, not slowed, stopped, the way a radio stops static the instant a station comes in clear. At his collar, under the shirt, a thin chain disappeared into the fabric, and every so often, without seeming to notice himself doing it, he reached up 2 fingers and pressed the collar flat, feeling for the small hard shape riding against his sternum. He had done it in the gate area before boarding. He had done it in his truck in the long-term lot before that, both hands on the wheel, engine off, doing nothing but sitting with the shape of the ring through 2 layers of cloth. It was Faye's wedding band, worn thin itself now, no longer fitting the knuckle it was meant for, kept instead where it could still be close to a heartbeat. In his shirt pocket, over that same heartbeat, rode a folded square of paper gone soft as cloth, from a half-century of exactly this treatment. Pocket, hand, pocket. He had touched it once already this flight, before the seatbelt sign, while the cabin around him rustled with magazines and headphone cords and nobody was paying him any attention at all, which was precisely when he did it. He did not unfold it in public. He never had, not once in 53 years, though he could have recited every word on it blind, the columns of hours logged in pencil so light it had to be protected from the light itself, and at the top, in a hand steadier than the one that wrote it now, a call sign nobody living had spoken aloud to him in longer than most of the passengers around him had been alive. He had married Fay Colvin the spring after he came home, and for 51 years after that he had never once told her the call sign meant anything, and she had never once asked twice. She used to hum while he worked, an old hymn with no fixed words, standing in the doorway of the machine shed with a glass of tea sweating in her hand while he lay under the tractor with a wrench, and the tune would drift down through the grease and the diesel smell and settle over him, like something with a right to be there. She had been gone 6 years now, of a heart that simply stopped one November night in her sleep, gently, the way a candle goes out when there's nothing left to burn, and he still caught himself waiting, some mornings in the shed, for a hum that wasn't coming. He did not think of any of that now, in seat 14C, not in words. He only reached up once more, pressed his collar flat, and set his jaw a fraction tighter, and waited for the cabin to finish turning toward everyone but him. 9 rows forward. Kendra Ashcroft was already moving before the captain's second broadcast finished, echoing off the overhead bins. 6 years with Merritt Atlantic had taught her that panic spreads at exactly the speed you let it, and she had built her entire professional self around not letting it. She went down the aisle with her hands loose and her voice pitched low, stopping first at a man in an aisle seat who had his phone raised and thumbing frantically at a screen with no signal to receive. "Sir, I need you to put that away and keep your belt fastened," she said, not unkindly, taking the phone gently out of his hand and setting it face down in the seat pocket in front of him. "We are handling this. I need everyone in their seats." He looked at her the way frightened passengers always looked at uniforms, as if the fabric itself were a kind of promise, and he sat back and did what she said, and that was worth something, that a stranger's voice could do that for a stranger's fear. She had asked the question 3 times already over the interphone to the other flight attendants, working the cabin methodically from front to back, the way her training had drilled into her. Any pilots aboard, any military aviation experience, any commercial rating at all, please identify yourself now. She had passed row 14 without slowing. An old man in a canvas coat, hands folded, eyes closed or nearly closed, did not register on her as a category worth a second look, and she would have told you, if you'd asked her in that moment, that she was not being unfair, only efficient, that a cabin this frightened did not have time for her to stop and study every unlikely face. She believed this. It was not cruelty, it was procedure, doing exactly what procedure is built to do, which is to sort 186 strangers into likely and unlikely before there is time to be wrong about it twice. She reached the galley and told Whitney Ogle, in the clipped shorthand the two of them had developed over 18 months of working the same routes, "Nothing. Nobody's raised a hand. Keep circulating. Keep them calm. Do not let anyone stand." Whitney nodded and went the other direction, and for a moment, in the narrow steel space of the aft galley, Kendra allowed herself 3 full seconds of stillness, hands braced on the counter, before she straightened and went back out to do it again. That was when the aircraft dropped. It was not a bump. It was the floor going out from under 186 people at once, the overhead bins screaming open in 3 places, a drink cart breaking its brake and slamming into a bulkhead hard enough to dent it, and somewhere forward, past the curtain, a sound that would replay in Kendra's memory for a long time afterward, a heavy, wrong, human sound, a body meeting a hard surface without any of the give a body is supposed to have time to prepare for. The aircraft rolled, corrected, rolled again, and for 11 or 12 seconds nobody in the cabin, including Kendra, was doing their job, because there was no job to do, except hold on and wait to find out what the airplane still had left to give. When it steadied, ragged and shaking but level, Kendra was on the floor of the aisle, with her knee twisted under her, and the sound from the flight deck had not stopped. It had only changed, becoming voices now, one calm and clipped and asking questions, the other not answering at all. The intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice, when it came, no longer had the flat professional register she had heard him use on every one of the 4 flights they'd worked together this month. It had the sound of a man reading numbers off a page he did not want to be holding. "Flight attendants, secure the cabin. First officer is injured. I need medical if we have it." A pause, 3 seconds, 4. "And if there is anyone aboard, anyone, who has flown a high-performance aircraft, combat or otherwise, please identify yourself immediately. This is not a drill." Kendra pulled herself up, using the seatbacks on either side of the aisle, her knee already stiffening, and looked toward the curtain. And for the first time in 6 years of doing this job well, she did not know what came next. The silence that followed the captain's second, more desperate call was not the ordinary silence of a quiet cabin. It had weight to it, the particular density of 186 people, each waiting for someone else to be brave first. A man near the emergency exit rose halfway out of his seat, one hand on the armrest, looked left and right, as if bravery might be visible on somebody's face, found none, and sat back down, his mouth still open on whatever he had been about to offer. 2 rows behind him, a woman went very quiet in a way that was louder than speech, her eyes fixed forward on the curtain, both hands pressed flat against her thighs, not moving, not blinking. In the aft galley, Whitney Ogle had stopped circulating. She was 24 years old, 2 years into this job, and she had been trained the same way Kendra had been trained, to read a cabin in glances, and something in her glance kept snagging on seat 14C. She could not have told you, if pressed, exactly what it was. It was not that Wendell Colvin looked capable in any obvious way. It was that everyone else in the cabin was doing something with their fear, twisting it into motion or noise or stillness that had a jittery, held quality to it, and Wendell was not doing any of that. His stillness had a different grain to it. It looked less like a man frozen and more like a man waiting for the right moment to stop waiting. She watched him lift his right hand from his lap. It trembled, faintly, on the way up, the way it always did before it had a task, and then it found the call button above his head and pressed it, once, with no more urgency than a man ordering a second cup of coffee. The small chime sounded, cutting through the tension with an absurdity that almost made Whitney laugh, except that nothing about his face invited that. Kendra was 3 rows away when the chime went off, kneeling to check on the man who'd half risen and sat back down, and she straightened, scanning for the source with the particular irritation of someone who assumed, in a moment already stretched past its limits, that some passenger wanted a blanket. She found seat 14C. She found the old man's hand still resting near the button, not urgent, not raised in the air, the way you'd expect from someone with an announcement to make. "Sir, I need you to keep your seat," she said, already turning to move past him, her mind still cycling through medical kits and the injured first officer and whether anyone farther back had responded to the actual question that mattered. "I flew fighters," Wendell said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be, in a cabin gone that quiet. F-4 Phantoms, 69 to 73. Da Nang, mostly, some out of Ubon. He said it the way another man might read a grocery list, 3 facts laid down one after another, with no weight added to any of them, because the facts did not need his help to matter. 400 hours in combat, give or take. I haven't touched a set of controls since 1973, and I want you to hear me say that part too, because it's true, and it matters. Kendra looked at him for a long beat, and the disbelief on her face was not unkind, exactly, but it was total. She had spent 6 years learning to read a cabin, and everything in her training told her that the man in front of her, coat gone the color of dust, hands folded and one of them trembling now that it had finished its job at the call button, did not match anything she had been taught to look for in a hero. "Sir, I appreciate that you want to help," she said carefully, "but I need to verify." "There's no time to verify," Whitney said from 3 feet away, and both of them turned, surprised, because Whitney had not spoken above a murmur to a passenger in 18 months on this job. "Kendra, look at him." Kendra looked at him again. Whatever she saw the second time was not different from what she'd seen the first time, not in any way she could have described, but something in her had shifted half a degree, enough to make her reach for the handset instead of the objection still sitting in her mouth. "Flight deck, this is Ashcroft. I have a passenger who says he's a former combat pilot. F-4 Phantoms, he says. 70s. I don't know what to do with that." There was a burst of static, the sound of the injured captain's hand fumbling for something, and then a new voice entirely, patched in from the ground, calm and low, and used to carrying weight through a radio. "This is Grady Pemberton, dispatch operations. I'm on the line now. Go ahead and put him on." Kendra held the handset toward Wendell, who took it without hurry, his trembling hand steadying the instant it closed around the receiver, the way it always did the moment it had real work. "This is Wendell Colvin," he said. "Call sign was Ironplow. 406 combat hours, F-4D and F-4E, 55th Tactical Fighter Squadron, based Ubon, flying out of Da Nang more often than not, 69 through 73. The radio gave back nothing. 1 second, 2, 3 full seconds of dead air, stretched long enough that Kendra glanced at the handset to make sure the line hadn't dropped, and in the aft galley, Whitney held her breath without knowing she was doing it. "Ironplow," Grady Pemberton said finally, and something in his voice had changed entirely, gone from procedural calm to something quieter and stranger, a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the next 20 minutes. "Mr. Colvin, sir, it's an honor. Get him to that flight deck right now, Miss Ashcroft, right now." Wendell handed the receiver back, rose from seat 14C, with the unhurried economy of a man who has never once in his life needed to move faster than the moment required, and stepped into the aisle. His coat swung once and settled. His hand found his collar, pressed it flat for half a second, found the shape of the ring beneath the fabric, and let go. The folded paper in his shirt pocket did not move, because he had not touched it, not this time, not with 100 eyes on him and no privacy left to spend on it. He walked forward past rows of faces he did not look at, and the whole cabin, for the first time since the drop, seemed to be holding its breath in the same direction at once. The flight deck was nothing like the world he remembered. Wendell stepped through the door into a space that had traded every dial and needle he had ever trusted for a wall of glass. 6 flat panels glowing with numbers and symbols arranged in a language he had never been taught to read. There was no yoke rising from a simple column the way he recalled it, only a smaller side stick and a row of switches labeled in a shorthand that meant nothing to his eye. The captain lay slumped against his harness, breathing but unresponsive, a thin line of blood at his hairline that Whitney was already pressing a cloth against from behind. The first officer was conscious, barely, his left arm held wrong against his body, his eyes unfocused but moving. Wendell lowered himself into the captain's seat the way he'd have lowered himself onto a stool in his own barn, testing its give before trusting his full weight to it, and found the radio panel already patched through, Grady Pemberton's voice waiting on the other end. "Mr. Colvin, I'm going to walk you through this a piece at a time," Grady said. "I flew C-130s, and I've got some jet time, so I know this bird well enough, but I need you to tell me what you're seeing, because I can't see your panel and you can't see mine." "I'm seeing glass," Wendell said. 6 screens, no needles, no horizon bar I recognize, though something in the middle of the left one looks like it wants to be one. That's your primary flight display. The little airplane symbol in the center, that's you. The line above it and below it is your horizon. Artificial, but it's telling the truth. Line above the little airplane, you're climbing. Below, you're descending. Wendell studied it the way a man studies a language he half remembers from childhood, close enough to recognize the shape of the thing without yet trusting his own translation. And this stick in my right hand does what my column used to do. Same job, different feel. It's fly-by-wire, so it's not talking straight to the control surfaces, it's talking to a computer that talks to the control surfaces. You push, it interprets, it moves the jet. There's more give in it than you're used to, and less feedback. It won't fight you back the way your old bird did. That's the part that worries me, Wendell said, and it was the truest thing he'd said since boarding. I trust a stick that fights me back. Tells me the truth about what the air's doing. Behind him, the first officer stirred, a groan working up through gritted teeth, and his uninjured hand rose slowly, drifting toward the center console where a row of switches sat within reach. Wendell caught the motion in the edge of his vision and turned his head just enough, reaching over without breaking his study of the panel, and closed his hand, gently, but with total certainty around the other man's wrist. "Not yet, son," he said, quiet, the same voice he'd have used, gentling a spooked horse. "You rest easy. I've got it." The first officer's hand went slack under his grip, whether from Wendell's tone or from the effort simply being too much, and Wendell held on 2 seconds longer than he needed to be sure, before letting go and returning both hands to the side stick and the throttles his fingers were still learning the spacing of. "Grady," he said, "I flew a jet that told me everything through my hands and my ears and my seat, and half of what's killing me right now is that this one's telling me through a screen instead, and my eyes aren't as fast reading a screen as my hands used to be reading the air. I need you to understand that going in, this is going to be slow before it's anything else." "Understood," Grady said, and there was no impatience in it, only the sound of a man recalculating his own estimate of how much time they had. "We'll go slow. Slow and right beats fast and wrong. Now throttles, 2 levers just forward of the stick." It took him 4 full minutes to learn the difference between the airspeed tape and the altitude tape. 2 long vertical ribbons of numbers, scrolling, instead of the round dials his hands had once read without thought. And in those 4 minutes, the aircraft wandered 80 feet off its assigned altitude before Grady caught it and talked him back. Gently, the way you'd talk a man back from the edge of a roof, rather than order him. The learning was not smooth. It had the genuine friction of 53 years, each new fact sliding reluctantly into a mind that had built its trust in a different machine entirely, and neither Wendell nor Grady pretended otherwise. The storm found them again 40 minutes later, not as a wall but as a tightening, the outside air going the color of a bruise beyond the windscreen, rain beginning to streak sideways across glass that had been clear a heartbeat before. Grady's voice carried a new weight when it came back on. "Mr. Colvin, I've got one field within range with this fuel load. Meridian Regional. Runway's 5,800 feet, which is short for this airframe, and current winds are crosswind, gusting to 31. That's close to the limit on a good day. This isn't a good day." "How close to the limit?" Wendell said, and his voice had not changed pitch at all, though his right hand on the throttles had gone very still, the tremor gone the instant the number landed. "Close enough that I won't lie to you and call it comfortable." In the cabin, Kendra Ashcroft moved down the aisle, reading numbers off a tablet Whitney had passed forward, relaying altitude and airspeed callouts through the interphone, in a voice she was working hard to keep level. 2,000 feet. 180 knots. She said it again, 30 seconds later. The numbers changed, her hand not quite steady on the handset, but her voice getting there, degree by degree, the way a person's voice does when fear finally finds something useful to hold on to. The aircraft bucked hard to the left, then harder to the right, and Wendell's hands moved before his mind had finished the thought, correcting again, the side stick's unfamiliar give, no longer quite so foreign, after 40 minutes of forced acquaintance. "Sync rate," Grady said, sharp now. "You're getting a sync rate warning. Ease the nose up. Gentle, gentle." And Wendell eased it, and the tone in his headset changed pitch, and then went quiet, and for 3 seconds, neither man said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. 1,500 feet, Kendra called back through the interphone, her voice cracking once on the second syllable and holding through the third. 165 knots. "Copy 1,500, Wendris said, and did not know he had shortened her name in his mind to a single clipped syllable the way he'd once done with radio call signs, 50 years gone, a habit surfacing from somewhere he'd thought long buried. "Wind check," Grady said, and there was something new in his voice now, a half-second of hesitation Wendell's ear caught, the way it had once caught the first stutter of engine trouble before any gauge confirmed it. "Meridians reporting 240 at 18, gusting 26. Wendell said nothing for a moment, both hands full, the aircraft shuddering through a layer of cloud that had gone the color of wet slate. Then, Grady, that number doesn't match what I'm feeling through this stick. Something's wrong with it. Grady Pemberton sat forward at his console, 11 floors above a tarmac 400 miles from the storm, and did the thing that would matter more than anything else he did all day. He checked his timestamp. The weather feed on his primary screen read 2:40 at 18, gusting 26, and beside it, in small gray numbers he had never once had reason to look at before this moment, sat the time the data had actually been received by dispatch's system. 11 minutes old. 11 minutes, in a storm line moving the way this one was moving, was not a rounding error. It was a different sky. "Say that again," he said to Wendell, though he had heard it clearly the first time. "I'm telling you, the crosswind component feels heavier than 18 knots gusting to 26, Wendell said, both hands working the stick against a pressure that kept shouldering the nose right, correcting again. "Feels closer to 30. Maybe better than that in the gusts. My hands haven't flown a jet in 53 years, son, but they haven't forgotten what wind feels like coming through a control surface. That number's wrong." Grady's fingers found the keyboard, pulling the raw feed instead of the processed display, and there it was. A data lag his own department had signed off, accepting 2 budget cycles running. A radar upgrade deferred twice to protect a service contract nobody had wanted to walk away from. Small decisions, made by careful people in a conference room that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with cost. He had not made that decision. He had, in a quieter way, lived inside the machinery that made it possible. He had perhaps 4 seconds to decide whether to trust a company's instrument or an old man's hands. "Copy," Grady said, and his voice had lost every trace of procedural calm, replaced by something plainer and more urgent. "Trust your hands, Mr. Colvin. Fly the wind you feel, not the wind I'm reading you. I'll get you corrected numbers as fast as I can pull them, but until then, fly what's in your hands." "Copy," Wendell said, and eased the aircraft's nose 2 degrees further into a crosswind the company's own instruments did not yet know existed. The runway lights came up out of the rain at 800 feet, a string of white and amber swimming sideways through the windscreen, and Wendell brought the nose around in a long, aching correction, fighting a wind that was, he now knew, worse than anyone on the ground had told him. 600 feet, 400, Kendra's voice in his headset, steadier now than it had been at any point in the flight, calling airspeed at intervals that felt, to Wendell, like a hand on his shoulder. At 200 feet, with the runway threshold sliding beneath the nose and the wheels, a heartbeat from touching, Whitney Ogle, pressed against the cockpit doorway where she had no real business being, saw it first, through the rain-smeared side glass. A boxy yellow vehicle, lights flashing weakly, still creeping across the far end of the runway. A maintenance crew, clearing debris from an earlier storm cell that nobody on the ground had cleared in time to tell them about. "Go around," she said, and her voice, young and untrained for this, still carried far enough. "There's a truck on the runway. Go around. Go around." Wendell's hands moved before the sentence finished, throttles forward, nose up, the aircraft groaning as it clawed back into the storm it had just spent 9 minutes fighting its way out of, the runway lights sliding away beneath them and back into rain. "Fuel," Grady said, his voice gone tight. "Check your fuel, Mr. Colvin. Tell me what you're seeing." Wendell found the number on the unfamiliar display and read it aloud, and it was smaller than either of them wanted it to be. 31 minutes, he said. "Give or take what this storm costs me getting back around." Neither man said what they were both thinking, which was that 31 minutes was not a great deal of time to learn, for the second time, how to land a jet he had never landed once. The hold pattern Grady gave him was tight and low, threading a gap between 2 cells that the radar, even the stale radar, agreed was survivable, and for 90 seconds, neither man spoke at all, the only sound in Wendell's headset, the hiss of an open channel, and faint beneath it, his own breathing. "Mr. Colvin," Grady said finally, quieter than before, the professional cadence of the last half hour set down like a tool he no longer needed for this particular sentence. "Can I ask you something that's got nothing to do with getting this airplane on the ground?" "You can ask." "Iron Plow. 55th TAC Fighter. I had an uncle who flew Phantoms out of Ubon around that same stretch. Different squadron. He used to say the men who flew that many hours in theater and made it home mostly didn't talk about it after. Said the ones who did talk, you had to wonder about. The ones who didn't, those were the real article." He paused. "You never told anybody. 53 years. Wendell's right hand came up off the throttle for a moment, found his collar, pressed it flat, found the small hard shape of the ring beneath the fabric, and came back down to the throttle, steady as a hand had any right to be at 76 years old in the middle of a storm. "I flew 400 hours over there and came home to a woman who never once asked me to prove any of it was real," he said. "I figured if Faye didn't need the story, the rest of the world surely didn't need it either. I put it in a drawer, and then I put the drawer somewhere I didn't have to walk past it every day, and I farmed corn for 50 years instead. It wasn't a secret. It just wasn't anybody's business but hers and mine, and now hers is with the Lord, and mine sitting in this seat." He let a breath out slow. "I am not flying this thing to prove I still can, Grady. I'm flying it because Faye used to say, a promise made in a cockpit outlives the man who made it, and I made some promises a long time ago I never got to keep all the way through. This is the closest I've come to keeping one since." There was a silence on the line that had nothing to do with data lag. Behind him, in the cabin, Kendra Ashcroft stood at the cockpit doorway with the interphone still in her hand, and she had heard enough of it, the parts meant for the radio and not for her, to feel something in her chest come loose that had been sitting wrong since row 14. "Mr. Colvin," she said, and he half turned in the seat, the first time he'd taken his eyes fully off the panel since he'd sat down in it. "I walked right past you. I had a question that mattered more than any question I'd asked all year, and I walked right past the one person on this airplane who could actually answer it, because you didn't look like the answer to me. I'm sorry. That's not procedure talking. That's just true." Wendell looked at her for a moment, and something in his face, tired and steady all at once, softened without quite smiling. "You were doing your job, and you were doing it well, near as I could tell from where I was sitting," he said. "You kept 186 frightened people from becoming a panic, which is its own kind of flying. Don't spend the rest of today apologizing to me. Go check on that first officer, make sure he's stable, and get everybody's belts locked down tight, because we've got maybe 28 minutes of fuel and one more chance at this, and I intend to use it." She nodded, and there was nothing procedural in the nod at all, and she turned and went back to do exactly what he'd asked, her hand steady on the interphone, in a way it had not been steady an hour before. Grady's voice came back on, low and even, wind numbers refreshed and corrected now, pulled fresh from a feed he had gone around 3 layers of dispatch protocol to reach directly. 240 at 22, gusting 30, he said. "That's the real number this time, Mr. Colvin. I checked it myself. Runway's clear, trucks off, and I will be on this line with you every second until your wheels stop rolling." "Copy," Wendell said, and turned back to the panel and brought the aircraft's nose around, one more time, into the wind. The second approach was not gentle. The crosswind took the nose at 400 feet, and Wendell fought it back, with both hands and every ounce of a 53-year gap he had spent the last half hour closing one hard 1 degree at a time, the runway lights swimming up sideways through rain that had not eased at all. At 40 feet, the aircraft dropped harder than either of them wanted, a gust catching the wing and shoving, and Wendell's hands answered it not with panic, but with the flat, practiced correction of a man who had once done this at twice the speed, with far worse things shooting at him from the ground. The wheels struck the runway hard, bounced once, a full foot of air beneath the mains for a heartbeat that stretched into something much longer, and then came down again and held, and the aircraft screamed down 8,000 feet of wet concrete with reverse thrust roaring, and Wendell's hands steady on a set of brakes he had learned to trust only in the last 40 minutes of his life. It stopped with 140 feet of runway still ahead of it, The cabin broke into sound all at once, the particular noise of 186 people who had been holding something in for the better part of an hour and could finally let it go. Cheering, sobbing, a man 3 rows back, laughing in a way that had nothing to do with anything being funny. Whitney Ogle, sitting down hard in the nearest open seat and simply putting her face in her hands. Kendra stood in the aisle and did not try to stop any of it, because for once, there was nothing in the handbook that told her she should. In the cockpit, Wendell Colvin sat with both hands still resting on the controls for a long moment after the aircraft had gone fully still, the way a man sits with his hand on a horse's neck after a hard ride, not because there's anything left to steady, but because the habit of steadying has not caught up yet with the fact that it's over. Then his right hand came up, unhurried, and found his collar, and pressed it flat, and closed around the small hard shape of Faye's ring through 2 layers of cloth, and held it there. "She got to see that," Grady said quietly into his headset. "Off the record now, the professional channel, long since given over to something else. Wherever she is, I have to believe she got to see that." "She always did like to watch me finish something," Wendell said. And that was as close as he came, in front of anyone, to breaking. 3 weeks later, the light came through the kitchen window at his farm, the particular gold of an Iowa afternoon in early autumn, falling across a table that still had 2 chairs pulled up to it out of habit rather than need. Wendell sat at his own table with a pencil in his trembling right hand, and the tremor did not stop this time, because there was no task fierce enough to still it, only a small and quiet one, and he let it shake a little as he wrote. He drew the folded paper from his shirt pocket, soft as cloth from 53 years of exactly this treatment, and opened it flat on the table for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, the old pencil columns of hours, faint but legible, the call sign at the top, worn but whole. Beneath the last entry, dated in 1973, he wrote a new line in a hand steadier than he expected, a date, a route, an aircraft type he'd had to ask Grady to spell for him over the phone, and beside it, 4 words that took him longer to write than the rest combined: "Flew her home safe." He folded the paper back along creases 50 years deep and slid it into his shirt pocket, over his heart, and sat for a while in the gold light with his hand resting flat against it, the way another man might rest a hand on a Bible, or a photograph, or the hand of someone no longer there to hold it back. Somewhere in the quiet of the kitchen, if you listened for it the way he still did, some mornings without meaning to, there was almost the ghost of a hymn, hummed low, with no fixed words, drifting in through a window left open to let the last of the season's warmth inside. Some of the steadiest hands in the room are the ones nobody thought to look at twice,